I got the recording. Hello once again, everybody. My name, again, is Enrico Manalo. I am the Chief of Learner Success here at All Aces. And we have partnered with Ashok Panikkar of Metaculture, who many of you might know. And with us today also is the CEO and founder of All Aces, Dr. Atiya Martin. And our topic for today, this is part 2 of our webinar series that we're calling From Kneeling to Standing Together. And the name of this session is Critical and Strategic Perspectives on Creating Buy-in from Dominant Groups. As you might guess, I am not the greatest at coming up with short, snappy titles. That's the best I could do. Thank you, Dr. Martin. I appreciate that. So just a quick introduction from each of our presenters today. Ashok, would you like to go first?
Certainly. Do you want me to introduce myself very briefly? Yes. So again, my name is Ashok Panikkar. I am, I guess, the founder of Metaculture, which started in 2005. I am hoping to bring to this conversation the many careers that I've had, and hoping to share with you what I have learned from my interdisciplinary career trajectory. I started in design and communication. I have a master's in critical and creative thinking. I have more than 20 odd years of working in diversity and cross-cultural training, and more than 20 years on working in conflict resolution and mediation. I also, for the past 7 years, have been working almost exclusively on trying to strengthen democratic societies. So I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you so much, Enrico, Dr. Atiya Martin, and her colleagues. This is exciting, and it's a very vital conversation. So thank you for having me.
Great, thank you very much, Ashok. Dr. Martin, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Atiya Martin. I'm the CEO and founder of All Aces, Inc. It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Rico, for all of your hard work and leadership. Thank you, John and Hyung from Team All Aces for kind of helping us to have an amazing event by doing the heavy unseen lifting behind the scenes. And thank you, Ashok, for being here with us and accepting our invitation to be a part of the All Aces extended family. All that said, one thing I will say is about All Aces is it's a pleasure to be a part of Team All Aces. It's a pleasure to work with our clients and to be able to bring all of our worlds together in this way today on this topic. And how do we reimagine diversity, equity, inclusion work? Where are there opportunities? This is a lot of what we do with our clients. This is a lot of what we try to do on intentionallyact.com. It's really about reframing how we understand the problem so that we can reframe how we understand the landscape of opportunities for action. So thank you all for being with us. We're very excited to hear our wonderful guest speaker.
Oops, sorry. Just some housekeeping things before we head into the discussion. You have noticed by now that we have muted all users upon entry, and that's simply to streamline the experience. We will give people the ability to unmute themselves once we have the Q&A, once we transition to the Q&A rather. How this is going to work is Dr. Martin and Ashok are going to have a very conversational style exploration of the issues at hand. And at about 11:30, we are going to transition to that Q&A. On the way there, if you guys could please drop any questions into the chat as we go along. our tech support today, John Monahan and Hyung Lee, are going to be collecting those thematically and just kind of helping people to ask the questions that they need to in a way that maximizes our time together. A couple other things, what did I want to say? Oh yes, the session will be locked after a certain point in time, and that's to ensure your security. We don't want to run the risk of getting Zoom bombed or anything like that. So if you do have to leave, there is a limited window to re-enter the session. Have I missed anything?
I think you're doing a great job.
Thank you. Even if I have, here we go. So if you guys could please kick us off.
Dr. Atia, I will defer to you.
Okay, so I think for today, you know, this idea of what is diversity, equity, and inclusion work, what does it mean to us in our personal, professional lives? What does it mean in organizations when we're trying to do work together? And where there are clear opportunities, again, for us to take back our power, our agency, to do the hard work of advancing racial equity and other forms of equity in organizations. I think there's a clear challenge with the way that we approach it today. You know, it's one of those things where if we are, if our current approaches are so amazing, right? You would think that we would see more progress, right? You would be able to put your finger on the pulse of kind of here's how, you know, our programs have actually moved the needle. What does it mean to make progress? What does it mean to have successful DEI efforts? What does it mean to do this work well in our organizations? And what is our role and responsibility as individuals who are leaders, as well as folks who may not be in formal leadership roles, but nonetheless have taken on the responsibility and the values of being leaders in the spaces that we're in. And so when I think about the opportunities Ashok is kind of sharing with us today, it really is about reimagining who we want to be, how we want to be, and figuring out how do we make sure that we're not fighting oppression with oppression. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I want to, I'd be interested, Ashok, in just you sharing with us, what is the overall philosophy? What is the challenge? What is the struggle that you have with the way that we approach it today? And
oh, so it's over to me, huh?
Oh yeah, well, this is a conversation. It can't be, you know, just Atia talking at people. So some folks are asking us very explicitly if we can kind of start with the basics. Someone is asking about the word choice of equity, why I'm using that word, and is there any difference between diversity and inclusion and diversity, equity, and inclusion? Did you want to talk about that?
Well, I thought, with your permission and the groups, I thought I would kind of take a step back and put the context, share the context as I see it, because I think at one level, part of my challenge in doing this work is that the world has changed enormously, even in the last 5 to 10 years. And the ways in which the idea of diversity, inclusion, equity have been addressed for since literally the 1990s needs to be questioned. So with your permission, can I share my presentation? It shouldn't take more than 10 to 12 minutes. And that should set the tone for some of this conversation. Okay. Okay, so for that, allow me to share the screen, and I will unfortunately talk to the group for a little while. I hope you won't mind, because I think it's in doing that that we should be able to kind of have some really provocative and powerful conversations. So I'm calling this presentation itself on surviving as a minority, outsider, and dissenter. And I'm really looking at this from multiple perspectives, from the perspective of diversity, conflict resolution, critical thinking, and democracy itself. So just a couple of posters just to kind of get the thinking going. It's always kind of troubled me that we expect our governments to be so much better than the way we engage with our own communities, and we expect a level of professionalism and morality which is very, very high, which is good. Great. High expectations are very important. But I also, given the work I do, I'm very conscious of the mismatch between our own personal standards and the standards we expect from governments. So I'm going to just quickly walk you through the different places I'm coming from. First, my understanding of history itself. And I have been always a student of history, but particularly in the last few years, I have paid a lot of attention. And one of the things that I realize is that societies, nations, and civilizations fall in fairly predictable ways, despite the fact that each one of them is unique in its own way. And one theme running across all of this is conflict. And the conflict very often comes because they lose a common narrative, a common story. One could even call it a creation myth, because without one common story or creation myth, people have very little to hold themselves together by. I have been neck deep in conflict resolution for 20 plus years. And what this has taught me is, well, including people like me who specialize in this, we are not very receptive to difficult conversations ourselves. I have found that my greatest failures in dialogue are with fellow professionals themselves. So dialogue is very difficult. I know the last session we had a great presentation on dialogue, and the one thing I just want to add to that is it is not intuitive. It's very difficult to stick in a dialogue which challenges me. The second is that it's so important because when conflicts are unmanaged, it destroys not just relationships, but entire societies and nations. Then, I'm not a student of biology, never was after high school, but I've become a great admirer of the kind of lessons that biology teaches us about human nature and about group natures. And one of the things that has struck me, which is counterintuitive to everything I believed for the first 20, 30 years of my working life, is that while as humans we have the capacity for compassion, consciousness, and reason, we're not very good at manifesting it, particularly when we are feeling threatened. It was also an eye-opener for me to recognize that all societies are mere extensions of our individual and collective emotional states. Another little poster. Democracy is an extraordinarily challenging political system. There are so many easier ways to run a society. There are so many easier ways to run any group. And it's because it expects people to think for themselves. And one, not be manipulated by powerful leaders, demagogues. Two, not take the easy way out and follow our group. So it's very important that democracy is supported primarily by a well-thinking citizenry. And unfortunately, most societies have not invested in developing this capability in its citizenry. When I say politics, I'm really referring to the politics of democracy, because politics is messy engagement, and that's what democracy promises us. And with messy engagement comes the ever-present possibility of corruption. It's intrinsic to democracy. You cannot have a corruption-free system in a democracy, because it allows not just multiple voices, it allows multiple ways of engaging with each other. But this is a price we pay for freedom and democracy. If we want to stamp out messiness, inefficiency, and corruption, we get despotism. We get an enlightened form of fascism. Particularly in the last 10, 15 years, I've become very conscious of the fact that what happens in my country or my town and with my own freedoms is to a large extent dependent in our interconnected world on what's happening geopolitically. In other words, if despots in Beijing or Moscow are feeling insecure about their own rule, there is a blowback on people in democratic countries, particularly minorities, because there's a way in which we do not live in a bubble where one country has tremendous freedoms and rights, and its neighbors or its big regional neighbor is so autocratic that spills over in multiple ways. This has led me to the realization that human rights themselves or itself is unsustainable in a very connected world, which is also unfree. I have had 2 stints in managing organizations. I founded a communication and design firm at 23, and I ran it for 11 years. I tried to do it democratically, even though in those days I had a crude understanding of what that was. From 2005 to 2016, I ran Metaculture in India. And I have to say, in the most sincere way, I tried to make it as democratic as possible. I didn't succeed very much. In some ways, in some moments of my 12-year tenure, I even failed spectacularly. And here's what I have learned. Everybody loves their own rights, raises, praise, and they love to have freebies. But very few people take kindly to feedback, responsibility, or accountability. And very few people take kindly to hard times when it's not possible to give the raises or bonuses that people sometimes deserve. And even if they don't deserve, it doesn't go down well. Very few people want accountability. Rather, they don't want to be held accountable. And when you don't have accountability, you get anarchy. Something that I have learned as a consultant with organizations that pride themselves on being flat and democratic is that with the best of intentions, when founders or executive directors start out with a democratic system, the pressure from inside more than anything else takes them towards a kind of unilateralism and even autocracy. There are complex tensions that either allow for democracy to prosper or prevent it from surviving. So what democracy itself has taught me is that this is not natural. There is nothing normal and natural about democracy. It is also not intuitive at all. And all of this, I realize I'm throwing a lot of ideas at you. And in the interest of time, I really do not wish to expand on this, but I'm happy to expand on any of this during the session as well as outside of it. Democracy requires enormous amount of reason, scientific processes, and evidence-based thinking. It requires both dialogue and debate, not just dialogue. It requires really rigorous competitiveness of ideas. It requires, and this was mind-blowing for me, it requires voluntary sharing of power. And I'll explain later what that means. And as I've said, it is, as always, it's always a work in progress and it's messy. You do not get anything but compromise solutions in a democracy. Anyone looking for perfect solutions is asking for something other than a democracy. In our experience in history, through history, we learn that all attempts at perfection leads to a kind of despotism and tyranny. And of course, as we've looked at earlier, despotism is the natural outgrowth of the collapse of democracies. I'll just read this out. Moral outrage without succumbing to confusing doubt makes for bold and powerful statements. There's something wonderful about fighting the system, fighting the oppressor. Alas, democracy is designed for adults and other reasonable people. There's an inherent conflict or contradiction between fighting a democratic system and wanting it to be sustained. I'm not suggesting that you cannot have conflict. You need conflict. I'm not suggesting that protest should not be there. We need lots of protests. But there's a point at which this fighting and this continuous protest, one theme after another coming into the system, weakens the system. Which brings me to the theme at hand, which is that minority survival and thriving in a very, very disheartening way requires dominant group support. This requires the support of the powerful. And this leads me to another really important realization over the past many years. The only way you can get the support of dominant groups is if they see the benefits of democracy. They have to be able to induce to share power and resources. Because, and this is what is disheartening, the powerful always have other options. Throughout history, there's a reason why democracy has never really been sustainable for any stretch of time. When it's existed in the Greek states and in the US until the 1960s, it was a very limited democracy where the dominant group essentially controlled the power and the resources. The moment you open it up to all different groups, you need, or I'll put it another way, we minorities need the acquiescence of the majority group to keep the systems going, because a dominant, powerful group always has the capacity to say, you know what, we don't need this complicated, messy system. We're good without democracy. And that's what you're seeing in Eastern and Central Europe right now. After they got freedom in 1989 and democracy in 1989, they're realizing it makes life difficult for the majority. So, vitally, how do we not get by? What are things we should not do? And I realize some of this is going to be troubling. And I'm not suggesting that I like what I'm saying here. I'm merely saying that this is what I have learned after consulting with groups, after running my own organization, and after studying not just history, but current societies and nations that are struggling with democracy. These are some things that it doesn't help to do. Minorities must almost never seek exceptions from democratic processes, virtues, and standards. We should be very nervous about shifting discourse from reason to emotion and from facts to feeling. It's very dangerous. It's a slippery slope, because guess what? If I, as a minority, start saying my feelings are more important than reason or rule of law, it gives a pass to the most powerful to use the same argument, and once that argument starts, might rules. It is not strategic to threaten the dominant group's sense of security or well-being, because my own need for rights and freedoms is dependent on the dominant group feeling, you know what? I feel strong enough to share because there's greater value in having an equitable society. I have seen so much of this, particularly in the US of late, humiliating and shaming either the majority or dominant groups. It doesn't matter if it's white people, it doesn't matter if it is the middle class as opposed to the working class, it doesn't matter if it's men. I've even seen a certain kind of humiliating of heterosexuals. I really wonder how we expect things to go our way when we alienate the groups that we want to bring to the table. It doesn't help if we lose control of a peaceful protest, and it never helps if we threaten revolution. On that note, it does not help if we not only talk about the importance, but the coming demographic change, which will make the majority today a minority tomorrow. It's just strategically not useful, even if it is true. In a sense, it doesn't serve minorities anywhere. The cost of increasing the increasing cost of democracy and minority rights. It should not become more expensive to deal with minorities in an equitable fashion than oppressing them. And there is a tipping point in every group. So how do we get by? Pretty much the flip side. First, insist on democratic processes, no matter what the outcome. Demand high thinking and behavioral standards of everyone. And this is where we can hold the powerful's feet to the fire. Are you functioning in a way that upholds the greatest standards of this country? Model democratic virtues, even if it's easier to give way to anger or hatred. Demand not just rights, but responsibilities. And when we take on those responsibilities, deliver on them in a visible way. With our own groups, educate and advocate, all of the above. Hold our own groups accountable. Do not allow our groups to get away with sloppiness, with emotional reactivity. Recognize that iterative change is not bad. The alternative, revolution, does not have a great history. Finally, at the end of the day, how can we, individuals, by being wise citizens, mature citizens, how can we really add heft to the idea of DEI? We can know more. I'm surprised so often that amongst many of my own friends and people who do this work, their understanding of history almost seems to be limited to the history of slavery and colonization. Human history is very complex. Slavery and colonization are terrible, terrible things that have happened and continue to happen. However, there is a much larger knowledge base that we must have at our fingertips if we are to address these challenges. We need to not only speak truth to power, which is very fashionable today. And I want to say, given my experience working in other countries, it's easy to speak truth to power in a democratic countries. You try doing that in China, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, or anywhere else. It's much harder in a democratic country to speak truth to your own peer group, to your own colleagues, to your allies. And that's important for us. I want to introduce two terms that are very important, egocentricity and sociocentricity. Much of our biases and prejudices come from one, being stuck in our heads, and two, being stuck in our bubbles. We need to understand what democracy is at a more complex level. In fact, most of my work today is about educating people about how nuanced and complex democracy is and how vulnerable it is, and that it cannot give us the perfect life. It can only assure us basic rights and processes. Everything else must be negotiated. And the beauty of democracy is, even if your opponents, so-called opponents, get something today, tomorrow I can come back and advocate against it. It also means if I get something today that's important for my group, tomorrow I may have to renegotiate that. And it's not a happy situation, but it is intrinsic to a democracy. This is what democracy can give us. It's the gift of continuous advocacy. Finally, a little poster. Keeping your rights and freedoms by attacking the dominant group is like trying to teach bankers generosity by forcing them to give you money. Once we use force to right wrongs, the rules of the jungle kick in. So that's where I am. That's who I'm going to stop here and allow the group and the facilitator to take this forward.
Thank you, Ashok. That is quite a lot to unpack, but one of the reasons why Team All Aces really wanted to get Ashok together with Dr. Martin is both Dr. Martin and yourself, Ashok, have incredibly nuanced and obviously thoroughly researched views on complex issues. And one of the huge challenges there is communicating that in really easily understood and digestible ways. I should also note at this point that for people asking for the recording and things like that, not only will the recordings be available to you on intentionallyact.com, but we are also creating a course around those recordings, which will include supplemental resources and things like that. So please keep an eye out. But back to the point about language, if I can share something with you, Ashok, some of the language that you used in discussing your views, for example, a phrase such as human rights is unsustainable, that can provoke a strong reaction among people who might not see beyond the nuance, see beyond that statement to the nuance, right? And on our own team, there was some kind of questions about your views before the team got to meet you. But once they met you and got to hear from you what your ideas were about, all those dots were connected and they were very much excited about what you had to hear. So I'd just like to open this up to both you and Dr. Martin. How can we, in trying to communicate these complex ideas, how can we not create unnecessary pushback to those ideas through the way that we talk about them?
Dr. Martin?
Can we stop screen sharing for a moment?
Okay. Right.
So I think for me, I think language matters, framing matters, and being able to be patient with people in terms of where they are on their spectrum. Like, we're all in different places in our understanding of these issues, right? Sorry, my hair sometimes confuses the camera. We're all in different places in our understanding around these issues. We didn't all learn the historical context necessary to understand how we even got here to how the world looks today, whether we're talking about the US context or whether we're talking about internationally. Many of us also don't understand kind of human development and human behavior, and why we do the things we do, why we think the way we think, why we make the decisions that we make, why we are feel closer to some people than we do to other people for seemingly not on the surface, seemingly not obvious reasons, and sometimes for very obvious reasons. And so really the challenge in all of this is kind of accepting some things about the human condition, and being able to own that as individuals. And then what does that mean in terms of how we agree to engage with each other? So, you know, I use different language than Ashok, but a lot of the foundational principles and considerations are all there, right? And so this idea that we kind of, as human beings, tend to expect more from others than we expect from ourselves, right? That is a huge kind of pattern in kind of psychology, in from a critical thinking perspective. We do that all the time, right? It's easier for us to see the mistakes and the problems with other people, other organizations, than it is to see it with ourselves and with what's going on in our own organizations and in our own lives, in our own homes. And so we tend to then focus our energy externally. We focus on what everybody else is doing or not doing instead of what we can be doing, or what we're not doing, and how we actually want to be in the world, how we actually want our organizations to be, to make the decisions about who we want to be as people, to actually own that responsibility, to own that power that we get to decide who we want to be and how we want to be. We get to decide how our organizations operate and run. And that responsibility actually takes a lot of work. It's a lot of extra effort. You know, it's almost like when folks talk about, you know, bringing on new staff or an intern. And sometimes we're like, oh yeah, we definitely need help. We definitely need to bring people on. And we forget the work it takes to actually get help, right? There's actually a whole layer of work it takes. And then we get overwhelmed by the fact that we're already overwhelmed because we need the help, but also the time it takes to get people up to speed, to invest in them so that we can actually be in relationship and be in collaboration and be in partnership with one another. It's easier to just throw our hands up and I'll just do it myself and I'll figure it out, and burn ourselves out, and alienate people, and kind of really take positions that are really about ourselves and our own perspectives and our own needs and our own wants, versus thinking about us being interdependent and being connected, and that what I do impacts other people. What I say impacts other people. How I approach people and things and situations, how I run my organization impacts other people. And if I can't keep that in the front of my mind, by default, my default behavior will be to focus on myself, right? And my personal wants and my personal needs, because that's what's a lot of stuff going on in our heads. So really having the opportunity to build the skills that it takes to do all the things that I just mentioned, right? It's actually a whole set of skills, of knowledge, of tools that we have to deploy in these difficult moments and situations, whether we're talking about racism, whether we're talking to someone that we love in our lives, about conflict that we're having with each other, whether we're talking to our children about something that they did. Whenever we center ourselves in those moments, we always are looking at things in ways that are not going to lead us to the optimal outcome in those moments and in those situations, and really thinking about and applying those skills in ways that really challenge us. I'm not saying any of this stuff is easy. I think Ashok has been very clear, like none of this stuff is easy. But at the end of the day, I personally have learned that doing this work well and really applying it to myself in my own life, if I'm going to expect other people and other organizations to do it, I have to be doing it. And what I've learned in going through these processes and staying and continuing to go through these processes is that I've become a better person. I've become a better mom. I've become a better wife. I've become a better leader. I've become more patient with myself, with other people, and it's a constant effort. And then the last thing I'll say is really this piece around this work being hard is nothing worth doing or having is ever easy, right? So if we say that these are the things that we want, then what are we willing to sacrifice in order to get them? Our comfort, our convenience, what is it that we're willing to sacrifice? And we should be able to understand where people are and what they're willing to take seriously, or how seriously they take the issues by what they're willing to sacrifice, because this work is hard. And then I'll land with this quote that I used earlier this morning in the keynote I gave, which is my favorite quote in the whole wide world. Most people don't recognize opportunity because it comes disguised as hard work. And that's what this is. This is hard work. There's no equation. There's no easy answer. It's literally, you have to trust the process. We have to go through the process of figuring out who we want to be. And that takes time and it evolves. We have to go through the process of figuring out who we want to be collectively in organizations. Ashok mentioned kind of the community agreements on what are those standards for how we engage with each other. What are the values that anchor us when things get hard? Those are conversations that we have to proactively have. And we can't, and I think it's correct that we can't expect everyone to have the same level of patience and empathy and all those things. However, we can control ourselves. So again, turning the mirror back on ourselves and holding ourselves accountable. So I have learned also personally that I can't hold everyone to the same expectations, right? Especially of myself, because we're all in different places. And that's not fair to do that to people. So in order for me to stop judging people and stop kind of trying to change other people, I have to be in the moment with them. I have to actually engage with them where they are. And there are times where I'm not psychologically, emotionally in a space to be able to be developmental in that way. And I need to be self-aware enough to know that, so that I can step out of situations and get myself together, so that if this matters to me and I'm willing to make the sacrifice, right, I'm going to come back at it again, and I'm going to come as my best self so that I can really get the work done. But I also have to have that self-awareness to be able to stay engaged. So I think there are questions that people really have about what you said during the presentation. So I think I want to pause here and really spend a little bit of time kind of addressing some of the language. I think people are trying to connect the dots between kind of the language and the implementation, and how some of the theoretical pieces will work in real life in terms of how you framed this context. So I'm going to be quiet now and transfer over to you.
Right. Thank you. I think it's very important for us to recognize what we are hoping to accomplish. I mean, what are we trying to do? So for the first, throughout the 90s, or at least from the mid-90s onwards, I was a consultant trying to work with groups and communities to help strengthen the ideas of inclusivity, equity, etc. And that's where it was very important for me to meet people where they are, and to be very, very cautious, not just about language, but about the kind of ways in which I bring them to a place where change can happen. I must confess that, and this is probably what puts me in a very different place from consultants right now. I am not speaking as a consultant. I am not speaking as a facilitator. Over the past 3 to 5 years, I have moved from the role of a facilitator and a consultant to, and I want to use this word very carefully, the role of a teacher. And it's not something I ever thought I would do. And there's one reason why I believe I need to be a teacher at this point in history, my life rather, because I no longer feel that by working with small groups anymore and doing wonderful work with small groups, we can prevent the tsunami. And by tsunami, I am talking about a perfect storm that is going to change everything. Many have recognized that COVID is likely to change the world we are in. But I would say way before COVID, the extremely precarious and unsustainable economic model that we are following, climate change, the collapse or the weakening of democracies globally, all of these are coming together. And at this point in time, there's a reason why I decided not to do mediation or group facilitation for a period of time, even though I absolutely love that work. I'm totally committed to it. It's because, and there are many, many people, scientists and thinkers and intellectuals who are right now so terrified as to where we are. So here's where I am right now. My presentation as well as my analysis is based on the idea that we are in an extraordinary moment of crisis. And any little thing that we do in any democratic country can tip us over the edge. One thing that we all agree is that if Trump gets 4 more years, the survival of America as a democracy is in doubt. I would add to that many other stress points and pressure points that can bring about complete collapse. And that would be absolutely horrendous for minorities. In every town, in every country, the strongest will always survive in an environment where strength takes precedence over conversation, over dialogue, over negotiation. And unfortunately, and I want to refer all of you to a wonderful book that came out 2 years ago by Robert Kagan called The Jungle Grows Back. And I like to think of democracy as a civilizing tool, a tool that keeps the jungle at bay. Think of it like landscaping and gardening and agriculture. It's a way of controlling the jungle. But when those processes, the agricultural processes, the gardening processes break down and they are no longer tending to our patch of civilization, the jungle comes back. So please forgive me. I should have said this in the beginning. My use of language should not be what you use as consultants, should not be what you use as facilitators. I am talking with you folks because I'm hoping that through this presentation, the larger issues of minority-majority relations can be grappled with. And this is the language I'm sharing with you is not the language I would use if I were talking with a group of activists or doing a dialogue between red and blue folks in a community. I would tailor that language and frame the conversation to their needs and where they're at. But this is an opportunity for us to take a step back from what we do on a daily basis and see if we can the great stresses that are at play in the work we do. So I'm going to stop. I'm happy to address any question that others have.
I'm just going to add one piece so that we can, and then let's get to these questions because there's a lot that people want us to dig into. What I will say is I want to be clear about, for all ACEs, how we talk about issues. So for us, when we talk about the system that needs to be dismantled, we include people as part of that system, and that each of us as individuals are part of the problem and the solution at any given moment. And if we're not being conscious and present about that, then we can passively and sometimes overtly be supporting systems of oppression. even when we're on the receiving end of oppression. So as a woman of color, there are things that I have learned and how I have been taught about how I'm supposed to be in the world and what people should expect from me and what I should expect from myself and other people who look like me, that I had to unlearn so that I could figure out who I really was and how I wanted to show up. And that matters when you scale it up to, well, when we're talking about fighting oppression, when we're talking about really doing this work well, it's multi-layered, right? And so I personally have to own my power and my responsibilities. I have to be careful about making sure that I am not disrespecting the power of other people of color because I've been infected with this idea that we're supposed to defer to white people. I have to be careful in my expectations about how I show up in spaces and making sure that I'm not taking up too much space. That I am really listening to other people and seeing the connectedness of struggles. And let me give you some concrete, and then I'm gonna turn it back to Rico so that we can really, make sure that we get to these questions. So this next important piece is about how oppression impacts the oppressed and the oppressors. There's a certain level of hopelessness and helplessness that people display because of oppression on both sides. There are many times where we as people of color get irritated and tired of the struggle, and it's sometimes like, why even bother? It's exhausting. And I'm not seeing progress, right? I'm not seeing the kind of changes. I'm not seeing the kind of movement in my organization, in my community. Like when I look at the national landscape, I'm not seeing change. And it's easy to fall into that feeling of hopelessness and helplessness. When we reframe and we really look at what is it that that I can be doing in my own life, in my own space, in my own influence. So I use myself as an example. I was very frustrated. I was very frustrated with what was happening, with COVID-19 and the disproportionate burden it was having on Black people, particularly in Boston, where I live. And I spoke, I leveraged my relationships. I reached out to folks. I'm trying to figure out what the city government is doing. I'm trying to figure out, why aren't certain things happening in the community? And long story short, I realized that in talking to those folks that there was no help coming and that we were in essence, in many ways, going to be on our own to figure things out in the community. So I took that emotion and I moved myself over to looking for other Black people who were seeing this pattern that there's really no plan, there's really no strategy. And if we don't come together and figure out what we're recommending for what that strategy and what that plan should be, then we are being complicit in what's happening in our community. And so we got together and we said, okay, we're going to put together what this should look like, what this should be. We created a coalition and we worked very hard in order to hold ourselves accountable and what were the expectations of how we were supposed to show up and what we were challenging our folks in traditional leadership roles to do, and acknowledging that we are not trying to just be combative, right? We're trying to actually solve for specific problems and resources and how the response to COVID-19 was happening. And in order to do that, we actually wanted them to be successful. If they're successful in doing the work, then that means we get the testing we need in our communities. That means we get the things that we need in the community. And so by reframing it about and not giving up our power to just sit around and wait for somebody else to just have an epiphany, we came together, we did the hard work, we advocated with folks, we approached it. Both is challenging. There's nothing wrong with challenging power. We should be. And we should also, for me personally, and how we work with partners, is where are the places where I can use my agency and my power in order to shift the dynamics, to shift things. And so we literally were able to to shift a lot of how the resources were coming into the community. We're literally able to get meetings with the mayor, with the governor, with all these different folks to really challenge them, but also say, we're not here just to be combative. Like, we are partners. We've been doing work in the community and we can help you do this work better, because that's the point. The outcome that we're looking for is the resources and the support in the community. And recognizing that we took on the ownership of our community needs in doing that. And I'm not saying that's the way it should be. I'm not saying that that's the way it should all work. But what I'm saying is that's the way the world currently is. And so we actually leveraged our power, collective power, in order to really move needles forward. And we're still in that process. And so I'll stop there and let us get to these bigger picture questions around what does it mean to do some of the things that folks are asking about, particularly this idea of the relationship between the dominant and majority culture, and what that looks and feels like. So Rico, do you want to help us get to these questions so that we can really get to the meat of what folks are really looking for in terms of substance and detail?
Absolutely. And one thing that I just want to highlight for everybody before we move into that is, as Ashok mentioned, if we are moving from reason to emotion, that's where we see things like groupthink really start to creep in, that mob mentality. And I think it's important to remember, especially in the diversity, equity, and inclusion field, that a diversity of ideas is what allows us to explore the nuance and really get into the corners on these things. And that is one of the goals of us trying to bring this session to the public, because as a team, we feel like this is an important issue to highlight. There have been so many very excellent questions that I do want to have time for all of them. So if our behind the scenes facilitators, Hyung and John, could please help us to do that, we can begin the Q&A process. And for this, people will be unmuted so that they can ask questions without the help of a moderator. So Hyung and John, if you could please begin that would be great. Thank you.
I think that there have been a few different curiosities about digging in further around the role of protesting and systems, and how protesting weakens the system, and the history of how protests and violence actually has changed. And I think there's a few people who talked about that. And perhaps, you know, I'm thinking about Byron. You talked about some struggles between, you know, that majority, minority power dynamic. So I'm gonna give it to you to clarify your question. If you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick because there are a lot of good questions, but I guess it comes to something Ashok was saying, where, you know, it requires the powerful to voluntarily, I'm going to paraphrase, I guess, but that in order for human rights or minority rights to be respected, it requires the powerful to voluntarily do so. And I don't understand how, and then you're also talking about accountability. And so basically, and how people don't want accountability. So basically, I'm trying to understand what you're saying, because it sounds like we're asking the powerful to voluntarily opt into being accountable, which is just, you know, by your own analysis, it's not going to work. So, I mean, how do we get around that in order to really advocate for minority rights?
Can I take that, folks? Enrico? Okay, so great question, Byron, and let me clarify what I mean by that. All systems of governance, historically, 99% are top-down. There is somebody at the top that decides how to maintain order. If you look at all political systems, they are based not on freedom and rights. They are not based on equality. They are based on creating order within a group or in society. And order is most often historically created through very strong use of force. The rulers have the monopoly on force. Now, we call it despotism, we call it dictatorship. This is the norm, whether it's a monarchy or a tribal system or a feudal system. Historically, this is how things have worked. Democracy is an extraordinary invention that is counterintuitive, because it says we are not going to use pure force and brute force and strength to create order. We are going to create a kind of conversation, a representative model where we negotiate and create order. So to begin with, and this is why I'm a fan of democracy, however messy it is, it starts with the premise that we will create order through negotiation. Now this negotiation works only as long as there's a certain amount of accountability and responsibility that all the stakeholders agree to. And here's the thing, throughout history, it's not the weak who have been able to insist on democracy. It's usually the elite in most societies, whether it's the founding fathers in the US, whether it's the post-World War II democracies that flourished, India certainly, for example. It's the elite from the ruling or dominant groups that decided that we need a system which is more equitable. Now, it didn't mean they were pure. It didn't mean they were not hypocritic. It didn't mean that they really wanted complete equality. But they chose to create a system where there was by and large a certain amount of give and take. In other words, negotiation. Now, this system works only to the extent that everybody who has any kind of a role in it stays within the system. Now, I saw a lot of questions about protests. Protests are very important. That is the way the people who do not get a voice in the legislature, for instance, in the houses of parliament, are able to articulate and even put pressure on the system. The problem is, you cannot legislate through protests. In fact, one of the things that Obama said a few years ago, which was very striking, he said to protesters in the US, this was during his rule, he said, protest is all very well, but at some point, you have to come to the table. And if we try to legislate or change policy through protest, it weakens the system. The legislation has to happen after we are able to get people to the table to negotiate on the system. So when I talk of accountability, I'm talking of accountability of every stakeholder in a democracy. The accountability I was talking about, which is very difficult, is for me as someone, and I was talking about staff in a democratically run company or organization where everybody wanted all kinds of rights, all kinds of benefits. But when I said, okay, are you willing to be accountable if what you are suggesting fails? They didn't want to take accountability. When I asked them, okay, you are responsible, but if we follow your strategy and it causes us harm, how would you like us to, hold you accountable? They said, well, that's not my problem. That's the organization's problem. And I'm giving that as an example. And when you extrapolate it to society itself, most of us do not wish to be accountable. As Dr. Atia was saying, it requires enormous amount of responsibility, and we need to be willing to change internally in order to recognize that we have to sometimes give, not only take. So anyway, I just want to say one more thing. I am under no illusions that a 20-minute presentation will clarify these issues. This is why I have a 12-session webinar of each session of 90 minutes each, which is pretty much scratching the surface, because there's so much that needs to be understood if we are to grapple with these very, very complex issues. And again, I want to say there's a difference between working with groups to help them and understanding the larger picture, which will affect all those groups that we want to help. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ashok. There was another question. I think there's also been a lot of requests for more examples and specifics, and not just the person I'm gonna speak about, but there are many voices that requested that. But just to get a voice out there, Duncan, you did ask about strategies about how to invite the majority in, and also strategies for how to have the oppressed or minority groups want to work with the majority. So I think, you know, both if you and Dr. Martin could speak a little more to specifics. Thank you. And Duncan, can you go ahead and clarify your question?
Yeah, sure, thanks. Yeah, I noticed, yeah, there were a lot of people asking questions like this. And, you know, I hear the importance of needing to bring, you know, if we want to bring the dominant group to the table, because they're the ones who have the power to make some of the changes, then it needs to be inviting to them. So what are the kinds of questions that would be enticing, or strategies that would be enticing to bring dominant groups to the table to talk about how to make changes? And then also on the converse side, what are the thoughts about how to invite, you know, people who are an oppressed group or a minority group that have, you know, clear reasons to be angry and so forth, to want to engage in this kind of discourse with the dominant group. And of course, it seems like that's the essence of what democracy is going to require, is that we have to engage people we disagree with, or people who have different power, and that's the beauty of it. And I guess, like, what are the thoughts or questions or strategies that might, you know, kind of invite that kind of conversation? Yeah, and either Ashok or Dr. Martin would be interested in your thoughts on that.
Can I just very quickly address one thing that is not going to satisfy anyone, which is that before we strategize, okay, let me just step back. Before we use tactics, we need to have a strategy. Before we decide on a strategy, we need to identify the problem and really define it. Before we identify and define the problem, we need to understand the context very well. My fear, and as I said, I apologize if this is not going to satisfy many people right now, my problem is that, and this I fear, we haven't understood the context within which rights and freedoms can exist. We are very conscious that we don't have the rights and freedoms. And we have the experience of a civil rights movement and a couple of other examples from the last 40 to 50 years, and we are going by that. And I think that's very dangerous, because the world has changed since the 1960s and 70s. And if we don't understand the dangers that are lurking, we will be bringing a knife to a gunfight. So any talk of strategy requires us to step back and understand the larger context. Otherwise, and I'm very happy to talk about the specific example of Muslims in India over the past 40 to 50 years, whose situation is very analogous to minorities and African Americans in the US and other Western countries, and how the approach towards getting protection and rights and freedoms for Muslims backfired and gave rise to the right-wing Hindu Nationalist Party, where today most of their gains over the past 30 to 50 years are being rolled back, and to an extent that their lives and even existence is at risk. And I can give other examples like this too. So, but I can't do that in a Q&A kind of a format. There's just way too much. So I am going to just put here the link to my webinar, because really there are no shortcuts. There are no shortcuts to learning itself. So I just want to apologize for not having clear-cut answers to very complex questions. I would just ask that we really pay attention to where these questions are coming from and the environment in which these questions exist before we look for answers. Thank you.
So what I'll say about the question is, so for me, I think we often do this dominant, non-dominant group binary. And earlier I kind of talked a little bit about how, as a person of color, I can hold up the system of oppression, right? Like I can be doing things that support it. And so for me, when I think about kind of the work that we've done with organizations, the work that I've done personally on myself and that I continue to do on myself, it really is this idea of reframing the whole problem. So let me give some concrete examples so that we can connect the dots. So one is, in the current context, we talk about police brutality and the disproportionate burden of it on Black people in America, right? Black men and women are more likely to encounter the police and lose their lives. That's what the data shows us. That's what both the quantitative and the qualitative data shows us. Now, we could stop there and say that this is a Black problem, right? Like this is a problem that only Black people need to be worried about because they're the ones who are disproportionately burdened by it. But there's a reason that the word disproportionately is in there, because of racism, and that we've been taught to be scared of Black people. We're more likely to lose our lives. But when we swim upstream to the root causes of why that is, in addition to these ideas, the ideologies of fear against Black people, it's police abuse of power, it's overuse of force, it's over-militarization of our police departments, it's the deference we give to law enforcement officers as if they're not human beings like us, in that when they put on their uniform, they're still the same person that they were before they put that uniform on. And when we give people that level of deference, we oftentimes deify them in ways where they cannot then be held accountable when they don't live up to that deification that we've placed them in. And so we will make logical leaps to justify why they were right because we have deified them, right? And not seen them as real people. So if those are the root causes of the problem, then that's problematic for all of us, right? The disproportionate burden is on Black people and the stakes are higher, you're more likely to lose your life. But you can go in any poor white community around the country, you can go to any community in the country, and there's the troublemakers, however they've been framed and painted, who are also being harassed by the police, who are also receiving this overuse of power and authority, and this framing of law enforcement as kind of law and order instead of protect and serve. And so that is problematic for every community in the country, because then you have no recourse. You have no recourse for when the folks who have all of this institutionally backed power are abusing that power on communities, and there's no recourse. If you go to court, you're likely to lose. Perfect example is there's in 2016, this is one of the few videos that were caught on tape of a white man being killed by the police. And he was an exterminator. He came out, he had a pellet gun that someone from the pool area looked up in the window and saw him. He had other people in the room who wanted to see it. Long story short, someone called the police. They show up in full riot gear. They're waiting in the hallway, guns drawn. He comes out of the room with another person, and they basically start giving him all these commands. And in the most dehumanizing of ways. to the point where a man is crawling on his hands and knees towards the police and they kill him, shoot him in the hallway, right? How is that helpful for anyone? How is that about protecting and serving? Someone lost their life, right, in that way. And it's a microcosm of what can happen when we give the police too much power and authority to make deferential decisions in moments where there should be policies and process and structure and accountability. That's a concrete example of why this is so dangerous and how to reframe the problems that we're dealing with so that people can see the common struggle, to see the common problem that we're actually facing, and to be able to join forces and see why it's important to support Black Lives Matter, because it's not only about Black people, it's about understanding that Black Lives Matter too, and that the root causes of these injustices are systemic and they impact all of us in our ability to have a healthy society that we all want to be a part of and we feel good about having our children being a part of, and other people that we love. So all that said, I'll stop there and I just wanted to use, I said 2 examples, but I'm going to stop there because I want to make sure we get through as many questions as possible. But I think it's really important that we reframe issues so that folks can see themselves in the problem and the opportunity for us to actually live in the kind of societies we want, and the action and responsibility on us as part of that system, as part of that society, to help lead it.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. In what you were saying about change, one can argue, and this came up in the question, but that's Setu, please, I apologize if I say your name wrong, asked around what I think it was said or it was interpreted that protests weaken the system. And I would give the mic to you, Setu, to clarify your question. Especially around now, we've seen lots and lots of protests, and one might argue, oh, the protests have put pressure in forcing some change. So Setu, can you clarify?
Sure. I think I'm just more curious about what Ashok meant. I feel like there's a lot more in that little bit of a sentence than that bit, and I just wanted to see a bit unpacked, that's all.
Okay.
Can I just weigh in here, Setu? Okay, so the question of protests, protests are very necessary. Let there be no question about it. But protests are a deviation from the democratic process. It's very important to recognize the place for protest. Let me give you an example. As a facilitator, I run group conversations. And the process there is the group sits down and there's a facilitator and there are certain norms within which that conversation happens. And if one of the members is upset with either the facilitation or someone else in the group and decides to stand up and shout or walk around or walk out, it disrupts. But under rare situations, it might be a wake-up call to the facilitator and the group itself. But if it happens too often, the process, the facilitation, the mediation, the dialogue, the consensus building breaks down. So protest is useful, but it's a dramatic way of communicating. Now, if protest brings people back to the table and the conversation can happen in a more honest way, it's really good. But when protest becomes the norm, it's really saying that the communication isn't working. In a democratic situation, what it says is democratic processes don't work. The parliament does not work, the Congress does not work, the mechanisms for elections don't work. We can only get what we want by marching the streets. So that's not a happy situation, and too much of that, and we will lose the acquiescence, the agreement of those who are not protesting. And what it also does, and in India is a great example, we get to a stage where every group decides to protest one after the other with greater gusto and greater intensity leading to violence. So protest is important. Please, I'm not arguing against protest, but protest has a place. And as Obama said, after the protest, you need to come back to the table for some real democratic conversations and for negotiation. And if we don't do that, then protest becomes an end in itself. And the problem with it becoming an end in itself is not the protest. It leads towards riots. It leads towards violence. And once that happens, the entire system is at risk. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're heading towards the end of our time, but I think it would be great, you know, I can turn it back to you, to Rico, to have any closing thoughts or have him provide any closing thoughts.
Well, I think I'm not really so much the center of attention here, but if either Ashok or Dr. Martin have final thoughts, that would be great. And frankly, if the participants have final thoughts that they'd like to type into the chat, as I mentioned in the chat, I can post the chat log to where the recordings will be housed on intentionallyact.com, so we can all see those. And we are adding supplementary materials and things to the course that we're building around this core of recordings. So we'd absolutely love it if you guys would engage with that material, and you know, any feedback you guys could give us to help make that a better experience, please do let us know, and we will try to be as responsive as possible. So Dr. Martin or Ashok, please, any final thoughts?
Guest first.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Martin. I fear I've spoken a lot, and I fear that I have only not just scratched the surface, but provoked with certain ideas that require far more explanation. And I think this is part of the challenge that I face in doing my work today, as opposed to 5 years ago. 5 years ago, I was a consultant, and I would be invited into organizations or groups or communities to help them have better conversations and figure out how to bring about change. I miss those days because the context was very clear. I would encourage all of you, even as you continue to work with groups, to recognize that the larger context within which this wonderful group work happens has changed. And it's not just COVID. COVID is just one present dangerous phenomenon. Everything is changing. And here's what I want to leave you with. It's not a happy thing to recognize that the freedoms and rights we have now are extraordinary, and most people in human history have never had it. I would go to the extent of saying most people today on the planet don't have it. What we in Western countries and a couple of other democratic countries in the world, what we have, it's completely understandable that even with all of this, many of us suffer. The situation of Black people here, African Americans, the situation of Hispanic immigrants coming in, there is so much to be done. And we cannot destroy the very system that gives us these insufficient rights and freedoms. It's kind of like, and I'll end with this analogy, we cannot destroy the house we can't destroy the house that's protecting us merely because there's injustice and inequality in that house. Or to put it another way, if our whole house is burning, we have a responsibility to put out the fire before we can look at saving our own possessions or changing the group dynamics between the family members. We are a family, even if we treat each other badly. And all democracies are families by extension. The problem is we've forgotten that we are connected to each other. And we've come to a place where we are almost completely antagonistic. That's terrifying and that's heartbreaking. And I will just stop there to say, there's a lot we have to think about. And I would be very happy. I've put my email and my links on chat. I'm happy to continue this conversation. And I'm happy to learn from you because I truly do not have answers, but I do believe we are not asking the right questions right now. Thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Martin and Rico and all of you for having me here.
Thank you so much for being with us. And I'll just end by saying freedom and liberation come with a lot of responsibility. And I think when we look at societally where we have power, you know, there is a place for protesting to the points made in the chat. You know, it signals that things are broken, and how we can develop strategies that then build off of that, where we can then actually accomplish the goals that we're setting out to accomplish. And we're clear about what that strategy is, right? That's the power of protesting, is really about raising awareness and making people pay attention when they're not paying attention to the issues that matter to folks who don't have traditional power. And I think that when we also look at it in terms of organizations, it's really important because in the it being this work, because what we see in organizations is this pattern that whenever you have people of color or other underestimated groups in our society, whether it's women, the LGBTQI+ community, whoever we're talking about, when they are having this pattern of experiences, it is not just about them in the organization. I'm coming back to organizations here. It is a symptom. It's a signal that there are problems in the organization that need to be addressed. It's a signal that things are broken, and we need to get to the root causes of where those places are broken so that we can fix the root cause, right? So if we think that people not being promoted in the organization is a deficit of people of color, like they're not getting promoted because there's something wrong with them, then we develop these pipeline programs that then work to give people skills that make them better leaders instead of looking at the promotional process. And our role and responsibilities as leaders in organizations, as folks who are part of organizations, to be able to decide for themselves if they're going to own their responsibility and power for adjusting the root cause, which is the system, the process doesn't work. And when we swim upstream, we actually learn that there are a number of other people in the organization who also are struggling with getting promoted in those organizations because it's not transparent. It's not, what's written on paper doesn't match how it works in real life. And so our ability to listen to the people who are most marginalized in our societies, in our organizations, allows us to invest our energy in the most broken places of our societies, of our organizations. And so not to see it as a personal attack on us as individuals because we're part of a group, or a personal attack on us as leaders of organizations. It's an opportunity to improve. It's an opportunity to actually get better, to be better, to do better. And so I just want to thank everyone for being here. I hope you are able to leave here with, I'm sending you lots of love, hope, and action, and being able to continue to think through and do this work. Rico?
Thank you. One final word here from me. This is the second of our webinar series. We do have another session coming up on July 1st from 12:30 p.m. to 2 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Today's session was really about talking about what it is we can be doing in this current moment and the conversations that we can be having. And this next session that we're going to have is with an expert from Northern Ireland who is going to talk with Dr. Martin about what it is that we can be doing in a future-oriented way to think about what happens after we've protested and after the conflict has kind of simmered back down. So if you've registered for this webinar, you don't need to register again. We have your information and we will send that out to you. However, please do add us to your contacts, as we are aware that a number of people had our emails kicked to spam. So sorry for those login and Zoom info difficulties, but we are working on delivering a better experience for you next time. Thank you so much to everybody here for carving time out of your day. Thank you, Ashok, once again. Thank you, Dr. Martin. And thank you to Hyung and to John, who have been helping us out behind the scenes. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate the conversation. Bye now.